Long-term effects of colonial exploitation on former colonies, an expert's deep dive why this guide exists and what makes it different. Hey there. If you've ever found yourself truly wondering about the lasting impacts of colonial exploitation on former colonies, you're absolutely in the right place. I've been teaching this subject for years, and honestly, I've always felt that most resources out there are either too dry and academic or, frustratingly, too shallow to capture the full picture. My goal here was to craft something that's not just engaging and insightful, but, dare I say, even a bit fun to read. Think of this as a candid conversation between us, where we'll peel back the layers of colonial legacies and explore their intricate complexities. What makes this exploration particularly urgent in 2024 is how these historical patterns continue to manifest in contemporary global crises. From the ongoing debt burdens crushing developing nations to the climate vulnerabilities disproportionately affecting former colonies, we're witnessing the compound effects of centuries-old exploitation playing out in real time. This isn't just ancient history, it's the blueprint for understanding today's most pressing international challenges. Understanding the foundation, the colonial mindset. When we delve into colonial exploitation, it's crucial to grasp the underlying mindset that fueled it. Colonizers, in a deeply unsettling way, often rationalize their actions through a potent cocktail of religious zeal, raw economic greed, and an unwavering, often arrogant, belief in their own cultural and racial superiority. What's truly striking, at least to me, is how these historical justifications continue to echo, subtly but powerfully, in some of today's international policies and power dynamics. The concept of civilizing missions became a particularly insidious justification, where European powers claimed moral authority to reshape entire societies according to their own values and systems. This paternalistic approach didn't simply disappear with formal decolonization, it evolved into modern forms of conditional aid, structural adjustment programs, and development policies that still prioritize Western models of progress over indigenous approaches to governance and economic organization. For a deeper dive into these unsettling justifications, I highly recommend checking out our companion piece on understanding how colonial powers justified actions. Economic impact, a persistent legacy of dependence. Perhaps one of the most profound and enduring long-term effects of colonial exploitation is the ingrained economic dependency that many former colonies still grapple with. These nations were, for the most part, left with economies meticulously tailored to serve the needs of their colonizers. This meant a heavy focus on exporting raw materials while simultaneously being forced to import finished goods. This structural imbalance, unfortunately, created a self-perpetuating cycle of dependency that, in many cases, persists strikingly to this very day. Take Ghana, for instance. A 2024 trade report from the Ghana Statistical Service strikingly revealed that gold, mineral fuels, and cocoa products collectively accounted for an overwhelming 83.4% of the nation's total exports. Specifically, cocoa, a cornerstone of its economy since colonial times, contributed nearly $28.6 billion in 2024, yet overall cocoa export revenue actually plummeted to its lowest in 15 years at $1.7 billion, largely due to dwindling production caused by climate change, aging plantations, and inadequate investment in agricultural modernization. This kind of heavy reliance on a narrow range of primary commodities severely limits economic diversification and resilience, making nations incredibly vulnerable to global price fluctuations, a classic example of what economists term the Dutch disease. The situation becomes even more complex when we consider that many of these raw materials are processed in former colonial powers or other developed nations, where the real value-added manufacturing occurs, leaving the producing countries with minimal profit margins. It's a frustratingly difficult cycle to break, especially when many former colonies continue to primarily trade with their former colonial powers rather than fostering robust regional trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, which became operational in 2021, represents one of the most ambitious attempts to break this pattern by promoting intra-African trade, but progress remains slow due to infrastructure limitations and entrenched trading relationships established during the colonial era. Cultural and social disruptions, a patchwork of identities. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about exploiting resources. Colonial powers systematically dismantled and reshaped indigenous social and cultural structures, leaving behind a profound and often painful legacy. I've personally heard countless stories from individuals in former colonies who describe how colonial education systems actively work to erase local histories, indigenous knowledge, and native languages. This deliberate cultural imposition, in my expert opinion, inevitably led to a profound loss of identity, leaving many post-colonial societies struggling, even today, to piece together a coherent and authentic national narrative. The psychological impact of this cultural disruption cannot be overstated. Frantz Fanon's groundbreaking work on the psychological effects of colonization described how colonial subjects internalized feelings of inferiority, creating what he termed colonial mentality, a phenomenon where colonized peoples began to view their own cultures, languages, and traditions as inherently inferior to those of their colonizers. This internalized oppression continues to manifest in contemporary societies through preferences for Western education, beauty standards, and cultural practices over indigenous alternatives. Language policies provide a particularly stark example of this ongoing cultural disruption. In many former French colonies in West Africa, French remains the official language of instruction and government, despite being spoken fluently by less than 20% of the population in countries like Mali or Burkina Faso. This linguistic colonialism creates barriers to education, political participation, and economic opportunity for the majority of citizens who are more comfortable in their native languages. It's a generational disconnect that's truly heartbreaking to witness, where grandparents and grandchildren sometimes struggle to communicate effectively due to different linguistic and cultural frameworks imposed by colonial education systems. Advanced insights, the ripple effects in modern politics now, this is where things get surprisingly tricky and deeply complex. The political systems bequeathed by colonizers were often, quite frankly, designed to maintain control and facilitate resource extraction, rather than to genuinely promote democratic governance or foster self-determination. Unsurprisingly, these inherited systems frequently became fertile ground for corruption and persistent instability. I find it absolutely fascinating and, frankly, quite alarming how the echoes of these colonial administrative practices can still be distinctly observed in the governance challenges many former colonies face in 2024. From arbitrary borders drawn without regard for ethnic or linguistic realities, leading to ongoing conflicts in regions like Africa and Southeast Asia, to weak institutions and power struggles among political elites, the colonial blueprint for control continues to cast a long shadow. The concept of indirect rule, particularly prevalent in British colonies, created a system where traditional leaders were co-opted into colonial administration, fundamentally altering their relationship with their communities. This system often elevated certain ethnic groups over others, creating hierarchies and resentments that persist today. In Rwanda, for example, the colonial emphasis on ethnic divisions between Hutus and Tutsis, previously more fluid social categories, contributed to the conditions that enabled the 1994 genocide. Modern neo-colonial relationships further complicate this picture. France's continued influence in its former African colonies through the CFA franc currency system exemplifies how economic control can persist long after formal independence. The CFA franc, used by 14 African countries, is pegged to the euro and requires these nations to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury, effectively limiting their monetary sovereignty and economic policy flexibility. The environmental dimension, ecological colonialism's lasting scars. One aspect that's increasingly recognized in 2024 is the environmental legacy of colonial exploitation. Colonial powers systematically extracted natural resources with little regard for environmental sustainability or long-term ecological health. This pattern of environmental degradation has left many former colonies particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts, creating what scholars now term climate colonialism. The monoculture plantations established during colonial times, from palm oil in Southeast Asia to sugar in the Caribbean, fundamentally altered local ecosystems and reduced biodiversity. These agricultural systems, designed for maximum extraction rather than sustainability, depleted soil nutrients and created dependencies on external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. Today, many of these regions struggle with soil degradation, water scarcity, and reduced agricultural productivity, making them more vulnerable to climate-related disasters. Mining operations present another stark example. Colonial-era mining in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, and Peru created environmental damage that continues to affect local communities today. Abandoned mines, contaminated water sources, and degraded landscapes represent ongoing costs that former colonies bear long after the profits were extracted and exported. Frequently asked questions: how did colonial exploitation impact the education systems of former colonies? Colonial powers systematically imposed their own Western-style education systems, primarily to promote their languages and cultures, while deliberately sidelining and devaluing local knowledge and traditions. This strategic imposition aimed to create a local elite aligned with colonial interests, leading to a profound generational disconnect from indigenous knowledge systems. For instance, many African countries adopted English or French as the primary medium of instruction, which, understandably, can limit access to education for those who don't speak these languages at home and further contribute to a loss of cultural identity. The curriculum design in colonial schools focused heavily on European history, literature, and values while systematically excluding or marginalizing local knowledge systems, oral traditions, and indigenous sciences. This created what Nigerian author Chinua Achebe called mental colonization, where educated elites became alienated from their own cultural roots. Even today, many former colonies struggle to decolonize their educational curricula and incorporate indigenous knowledge systems into formal education. Were any positive developments brought by colonial exploitation? While colonial exploitation was, in its essence, overwhelmingly negative and extractive, it's true that some infrastructure developments, such as railways and ports, have remained somewhat beneficial. However, it's vital to remember their original intent: these were not built out of altruism. They were strategically designed to efficiently extract resources and facilitate trade for the colonizing power, rather than to genuinely aid local development or foster economic independence for the colonized people. Moreover, much of this infrastructure was deliberately designed to connect resource-rich interior regions to coastal ports for export, rather than to facilitate internal trade and development. This created transportation networks that often bypassed local needs and continue to shape trade patterns today. The famous colonial railway syndrome describes how many African railway systems still primarily serve extractive industries rather than promoting internal economic integration. How did colonial borders affect post-colonial conflicts? This is a critical point. Colonial powers frequently drew arbitrary borders with little to no regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or cultural divisions. This artificial amalgamation of diverse groups, or the division of existing ones, has been a significant source of ongoing tension, internal conflict, and violence in many post-colonial states, particularly in regions like Africa, where such borders exacerbated existing rivalries and created new ones. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers literally carved up Africa on maps without consulting African peoples, created borders that cut across traditional kingdoms, separated ethnic groups, and forced together communities with different languages, religions, and governance systems. These artificial boundaries continue to generate conflicts today, from the Somali populations divided between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, to the ongoing tensions in the Sahel region where colonial borders intersect with traditional nomadic routes and ethnic territories. What role does colonial history play in modern economic policies? Colonial history profoundly influences modern economic policies, often perpetuating cycles of debt and dependency. Many former colonies still adhere to economic models that prioritize export-led growth of raw materials, a direct colonial legacy that actively hinders diversification and resilience. What's more, the global debt crisis, with public debt reaching a record $97 trillion in 2023-2024 being the costliest debt service year, disproportionately impacts these nations. Many developing countries, often former colonies, inherited substantial debts from their colonizers or were forced into borrowing arrangements that perpetuate their reliance on external loans, leading to austerity measures that further cut vital public services. The structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions in the 1980s and 1990s often replicated colonial economic patterns by requiring countries to prioritize export production and reduce government spending on social services. International trade agreements also reflect colonial patterns, with many former colonies still primarily exporting raw materials to their former colonizers while importing manufactured goods. The Economic Partnership Agreements, EPAs, between the European Union and African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries have been criticized for perpetuating these unequal trade relationships. Is there a way to decolonize former colonies? Decolonization is indeed a complex, multifaceted, and ongoing process. It's far more nuanced than simply gaining political independence. It fundamentally involves reclaiming cultural heritage, restructuring education systems to prioritize indigenous knowledge, promoting genuine economic independence, and dismantling persistent neo-colonial power structures. Efforts are underway globally, from the Idle No More movement in Canada advocating for Indigenous sovereignty to the Maori language revitalization movement in New Zealand, which has successfully increased Maori language speakers from 157,000 in 2013 to over 185,000 in 2023. Organizations are also working to decolonize aid and shift power dynamics in international development, with initiatives like the movement advocating for locally led development approaches. Economic decolonization involves developing regional trade networks, promoting value-added processing of raw materials, and creating financial systems that serve local needs rather than external extraction. The establishment of institutions like the New Development Bank by BRICS countries and various South-South cooperation initiatives represent attempts to create alternative economic frameworks that don't replicate colonial dependency patterns. It truly requires a concerted effort from both local governments and international partners to reshape institutions and foster self-determination, recognizing that true decolonization is an ongoing process rather than a destination. Your personal recommendations and next steps. If you're as fascinated by this topic as I am, and I genuinely hope you are, I highly recommend diving deeper into specific aspects of colonial history. For instance, truly understanding the true drivers of colonial exploitation can offer invaluable insights into many current global dynamics and inequalities. Also, consider how historical injustices, like the Spanish Inquisition's impact on policies, echo, surprisingly, in modern times, revealing how deeply intertwined historical events are with our present. I also encourage you to explore contemporary decolonization movements and initiatives. Following organizations like the Decolonizing Economics Collective, reading works by scholars like Walter Rodney, Aimé Césaire, and contemporary voices like Sylvia Rivera-Cusicanqui, can provide deeper insights into both the problems and potential solutions. Consider engaging with media and literature from former colonies to understand these impacts from local perspectives. Authors like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Aimé Césaire, and Gayatri Spivak offer profound insights into the cultural and psychological dimensions of colonial legacies that statistics and policy papers cannot capture. Ultimately, I truly hope this guide serves as a robust springboard for your continued exploration and understanding. There's so much more to uncover, so many stories to hear, and I'm genuinely excited for you to continue this vital journey of learning. The more we understand these historical patterns, the better equipped we become to recognize and challenge their contemporary manifestations. Tags: colonial history, economic impact, social disruption, cultural legacy, decolonization, post-colonial politics, education systems, dependency cycle, environmental colonialism, neocolonialism, climate justice, indigenous knowledge, structural adjustment, trade patterns. This guide is a comprehensive exploration into the long-term effects of colonial exploitation, designed to engage and inform those who are passionate about understanding our shared, complex history. Enjoy the journey.